Okay, I want to welcome you, as we always do, to the summer time of this monthly series. I'm glad that we have a few extra chairs left. That's probably a summer phenomena, but I hope that you will be gratified by what we do. These monthly events, as always, are brought to you by three organizations that I wish to acknowledge and thank at the beginning. The first is the Judson Memorial Church, in which you are currently located, who is very, very kindly and very supportive of what we do, provides this space to us every month for this activity, which, as the minister told me, is part of what she believes to be the mission of this church. So I find that very interesting that she should feel that way, and I'm grateful, and I hope all of you share the appreciation of making this space available. The second sponsor is the Left Forum. It's the largest assembly of activists and academics on the left, hence its name, every year. We just had our last one in the end of May at the John Jay School. 4,500 people roughly were there. And that's their main activity of producing this event every year. But they also do a few other things like sponsoring this event. And finally, the third organization is Democracy at Work, which is literally the producer of this event and does the work both of arranging each of these events, of arranging for the video coverage that is being produced by Brian back there, who is a very loyal and reliable person doing it each time, as you probably have noticed, those of you who have come before. I want to thank you all, since you all paid $10 to have this experience, but I also want to speak in this moment to those watching, the tens of thousands that watch this every time. Once we're done, we can track that now, thanks to Google and so on. I want to say to all of you, you don't pay, but it would be nice if you did, because we have the same expenses and we need help in defraying those expenses. And so I would like to put a little guilt, I guess, out there to get you to consider going to our websites and donating as a way to do your part in helping to sustain all of this. I also want to make a special announcement, which we often do, to thank a sponsor. It is possible to sponsor these monthly meetings. And if you're so disposed, and if your wallet makes that possible, we would encourage you to do that. I want to thank, for this August monthly, Bruce L. Wallace of Vista, California. He obviously sees it by the internet. We're very excited to see support from the West Coast. We have quite a bit of it. California is a very important state in terms of the sponsors and the comments that we get on the internet. So I want to thank Bruce Wallace from everybody here, but especially from me, for being a sponsor. If anyone watching or here would like to be a sponsor, it's very easy. You just go to democracyatwork.info, that's our website, democracyatwork, all one word, .info/sponsor, and all the details and how you go about it will be presented to you there. If you are a fan of the weekly radio show that we produce, Economic Update, it's another project of Democracy at Work, a little news we have to offer you all. It's been a radio show since it began here in New York on WBAI in March of 2011. So it's now 6+ years old. We're very proud that we have not missed a single week in that period, not one. We're continuing. We are now broadcast regularly on about 84, by my last count, 84 stations across the United States carry this program. But the news, that's been going on for a while, but the news I have to tell you about is that we are now also a television program. That is, we have produced and we are producing a televised or television version of the radio program. So you can see both myself as I do the weekly show and the guests that I bring on for interviews and so on. Some of you know the economist Michael Hudson. We just finished an interview with him that will be broadcast later this month. And we will have many more, and I think you will find them very interesting. But the news is not only that we produce this televised version, but that we have reached an agreement with Free Speech Television to carry it to roughly 40 million American homes, which will start in a couple of weeks. It's an enormous undertaking, but it tells you again that this kind of work is receiving exposure and an audience that, frankly, I never foresaw I would see in my lifetime. So I'm amazed by it. I hope you are too. If you would like to see the televised version of the program, especially if you've heard the radio version, the best place for us, for you to go, would be to a website called Patreon, P-A-T-R-E-O-N, patreon.com. And then just look for Economic Update, which is the name of the program. And the reason is, if you go to patreon.com, there's a very easy way for you to be supportive of this program and of the work we do that's made available to you on that website. So if you might be so disposed, either those of you watching on the internet or those of you here this evening, you can both see the televised version and be a supporter by going to patreon.com, which I think you'll find interesting. Patreon.com/economic update will take you right there. And finally, we have stickers. I hope most of you saw them. It's our latest device to wheedle a little more cash out of your pocket. But there are stickers about who we are and what we do with a nice slogan on them. They're on this desk outside, and if you'd be interested to get those, please grab a couple on your way out. Okay, so much for the announcements. Let me get then to the updates. And the reminder, we're going to do a few short ones at the beginning and then go into the major topics that were outlined on the announcement I hope most of you have gotten in the last week or so. All right, I'm going to begin with what I hope is one of your favorite companies, Monsanto, the chemical company. Monsanto has the knack of getting into the newspapers a great deal with all kinds of information they wish weren't there because it exposes them for being less than the perfect neighbor when it comes to fouling up the environment with the chemicals that they produce. I wouldn't have brought this latest one to your attention if it weren't so terribly awful. So I thought, well, this time they deserve it, so let's do it. All across America, in the last few weeks, there have been pictures, television and newspaper pictures, of fields, beans, peaches, vegetable gardens, where the fields are withering away. I mean, the camera pans and you see, oh my goodness, everything looks dead or dying. But it's not because they had too much water, and it's not because they had too little water or anything like that. It's that around them, not at them, but around them, farmers were using something called dicamba, D-I-C-A-M-B-A. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. It's either dicamba or dicamba. It's a herbicide. It's a chemical that kills plants. That's what it's for. Now, the problem is it evaporates. It turns into a vapor, and then it blows all over the place, so that if farmer number one is using it on his or her fields, it has a high risk of blowing elsewhere on other people's crops. Well, if you start looking at the story, and the version I'm looking at comes from Reuters, the British news agency, and I have it here for anyone who would like to see it, the Reuters story here. And I really mean that. If any of you want to get a copy where to get the story and the details, you can come up here and get them. As Reuters explains, normally when a new chemical like this for farming is brought out, the chemical company gives samples to universities and to researchers so that lots of tests can be made to make sure it's safe before it goes out. In other words, you don't just rely on the company that manufactures it. It's their job, and it's the normal procedure. Monsanto didn't follow this procedure. And Reuters then went and said to the people who had done some tests anyway, what was going on. And they spoke to Jason, so you know where they come from, Jason Norsworthy of the University of Arkansas, Kevin Bradley at the University of Missouri, and Aaron Hager at the University of Illinois. They said yes, that Monsanto had provided them with samples, but the samples came, I'm quoting now, with contracts that explicitly forbade volatility testing. Of course, I had to go learn, what does that mean? Volatility is the word they use for the tendency for something to blow across another field. Why exactly it's called volatility, I don't know. Maybe it has to do with the molecules agitated or something like that. But a volatility test is a test for whether this chemical will blow somewhere else. This was new. They all comment in the article. It was new. We never got an instruction not to test for something like that. It's a normal, regular test. Well, they didn't because they couldn't. They were contractually blocked from doing that test, so they didn't do the test. So Monsanto then announced no bad results with volatility, which was a slight adjustment from the fact, which was no results from volatility. And they sold it all over the place, and it's volatile, and it's killing all kinds of things. And this has caused all kinds of criticism, and it got the following response, which I want to read to you, because if I didn't read it to you, if I told you I had heard it, you wouldn't believe me. It comes from Monsanto's Vice President of Global Strategy, Scott Partridge. You couldn't make a name like that up. Scott Partridge said the company prevented the testing because it was unnecessary, period. He said the company believed the product was less volatile than a previous formula had been. Then the best part, quote, to get meaningful data takes a long, long time, he said, quote, this product needed to get into the hands of growers. I want you to think. What the product needed was to make profit for Monsanto, who had made it. But you can't say that in American culture because that smells as bad as it is. So you've got to come up with something you can say that makes this stinking result smell like roses. So they are eager to get it into the hands of the growers and don't want to take a lot of time. This should sound familiar to you because it's the argument used by most drug companies to speed up the approval of what you are ingesting or being injected with, etc., etc. But they got caught. They were rushing it to the growers, which happened incidentally to make money for them. What they did was kill large numbers of our crops, which will affect all of you because it'll raise the prices of what you buy in the supermarket, and you will think this has something to do with the law of supply and demand, but it doesn't. It has to do with breaking the law if you're a big company and you think you can get away with it. What? Is nobody suing them? I hope. According to the Reuters article, not yet. Not yet. All right, the next item. The next item. The next item has to do with, well, let me be honest and tell you. I've been doing some work on the opioid crisis that I'm sure many of you have heard about, the extraordinary number of people that are taking painkillers of one kind or another and using them to dull the pain of living in the United States today. And they take too much of it or they take a bad quality of it and they kill themselves. We're losing about 90 people a day from overdoses of opioids. Opioids are the synthetic version of heroin. In the natural occurrence, it would be heroin. The synthetic is an opioid. The oxy, 27 different endings, oxy this, oxy that, that's an opioid, and so forth. And so there's been a lot of attention on the people dying from this drug and the explosive increase in the use of the drug and in people dying from the drug over the last 10 years. And I don't want to take away from that in any way. I've talked about it. It is an unbelievable crisis in this society, and it reveals something. If you take the time to look at it, it reveals a number of really interesting things, but I don't have enough time tonight. One of the things, though, I can't forego talking to you about is it is not an increasing crisis as much in the African American community as it is in the white community. It's more of a white problem. And it seems to have something to do with white people being particularly affected by the disappearance of all kinds of jobs in the last decade or two, rather more than African Americans. And in a sense, I don't want to overdo it, but in a sense, large portions of the white community are discovering what it's like to live in the conditions that African Americans know only too well for a longer period of time. And they are taking steps to avoid the pain of all of that aren't so different either. It's shocking for the white community to discover that all of that drug business had nothing to do with race and everything to do with the economic conditions that people were forced to live in. There might be a real learning there that can do something to reduce the racism that we have as a society. But I want to talk about something that I found surprising that you may also. A much bigger killer, a drug with much more terrible results, is alcohol. And some of the recent statistics about alcohol are so startling for me that I want to share them briefly with you because they have to do with the economics in a very important way. Okay. Let's go. Deaths in the United States. 88,000 deaths in the United States each year from alcohol between 2006 and 2010, according to the Centers for Disease Control. That dwarfs opioids. That's extraordinary. More than twice the number of deaths from prescription opioids and heroin in the last year, for example. The total includes drunk driving deaths and alcohol-linked violence, as well as liver disease, strokes, and other medical conditions. The Center for Disease Control says drinking too much is responsible for 1 in 10 deaths among working-age Americans. The social cost of excess alcohol consumption is estimated at $250 billion per year. The costs of all of this show up as follows. Higher healthcare needs, lost productivity, prosecuting alcohol-fueled crimes, drunk driving, homicide. The social costs of all of this are enormous. Why then is there an explosion of alcohol? And the interesting thing is, it's not among young people. It's among older people that the young people actually are drinking less. That may be because another substance has arrived and is easier to get. I don't know. But it is older people that are drinking themselves to death. Blame the old people. Yes, I'm blaming the old people. But I want to put the blame where I think it belongs. We have an economic system that doesn't work for the mass of people. We are not allowed as a culture to discuss that. We cannot have, except in a few rare situations, a discussion of the system that's breaking down. We all have to pretend, whether aware of it or not, that it's not about a system breaking down. It's about this law or that politician or this group of people, the old people, or what. But the notion of a system that isn't working for people and driving them to compensate for the failures of a system by injecting themselves with something or drinking too much of something, this kind of a conversation seems to be very difficult to have. With nice liberal people, you can't have the conversation because they want you to remember that there's a certain personal responsibility that a person has. I don't doubt that for a minute. There is some personal responsibility we all have. But we live in a society that way overdoes it on the personal responsibility and way underdoes it on the social responsibility of what's going on in the society that makes people do something as self-destructive as the excess alcohol and so on. And then I began looking into it, and here's some things just to leave you with about this. If you make a calculation, the price of alcohol relative to your income, then alcohol is cheaper now as a cost of your income than it was back in the 1950s. It has been going down relative to your ability to pay. Alcohol is a very cheap drug, especially in comparison with others, number one. Number two, advertising of alcohol is everywhere. It is ubiquitous. It is not controlled in most cases. Huge amounts of money are spent, billions, to promote its use. And even the Centers for Disease Control, even in the Trump administration, is putting out literature saying that it can't be a coincidence that the shooting up, pardon the phrase, the shooting up of alcohol abuse is beautifully tracked by the crash of 2007 and 8 and the years since. It's a wonderful statistic to make you stop the next time you hear about the recovery from the great crash. Depends on how you look at it and what you look at, whether there's a recovery. In terms of the suffering from alcoholism, there's no recovery, it's the opposite. Next item I want to talk about is jobs. And there I have to take the time it needs to do that. Those of you who pay attention to the announcement of the national statistics will know that Mr. Trump has been very gleeful in the last couple of weeks by announcing that the unemployment rate in the United States is down to under 5%. Now, I'm the first one to say, well, it's very important people have jobs, Lord knows. And getting the unemployment down below 5% is an important thing. What Mr. Trump had to do with that is anybody's guess. Most economists that I know, left, right, and center, would say something terribly close to nothing. But in any case, he's presiding over it and, of course, taking credit for it. But I want to look at it with you a little more carefully. What does it mean that unemployment is down? In order to get this, I have to, there's no way out of this, explain to you two things about the statistics. First, here's how unemployment is basically calculated in the United States. Interviews are conducted with people, random interviews, and they ask a question. Dear ma'am, dear sir, are you working today? And if you are, you are counted as an employed person. If you answer the question, no, I'm not working, you are asked a second question. Are you looking for a job right now, actively looking? If you say yes, then you are counted as an unemployed person, and the unemployment rate is the percentage of people who answer that second question, I'm looking. That's in the numerator, that's the number you're counting, and the base, the denominator of the fraction, is the total number of people in jobs plus those looking. So it's the proportion of those looking as the total of those in work and looking. What you ought to know, as I speak, is something is left out. What happens to the person who answers the second question, no, I'm not looking? The way we keep statistics is they're not considered to be in the labor force. They are not counted as unemployed. They're not counted as employed, but they're not counted as unemployed either. What this means is, and just follow this is not higher mathematics, I assure you. If this month I'm looking for work, and so I answer the second question, I'm looking, I'm counted as unemployed. If you happen to ask me next month, just by accident, you ask me, I've decided I've had it. I can't go one more time, say to a person, would you please give me a job, have them throw me out of their office. I'm not going to do that again. Instead, I'm going to rely on my wife or my uncle, or I'm going to do things I can't discuss in public to get by. Okay? And you answer the second question, I'm not looking. You know what? You have gone from an unemployed person to not being counted, which means that the percentage of people unemployed goes down when people are so disgusted about their unemployment experience that they don't look anymore. If that strikes you as perverse, it means I've gotten it across to you. That is the way the statistics are organized. Now, why is that relevant? Since the crash of 2007, something on the order of 5 or 6 million Americans have done what I just described. They've stopped looking. Which means the unemployment rate goes down because they're not in the labor force anymore. We actually keep track in this country of something called labor force participation rate. And that's what you might expect. It measures the number of people that either have a job or are looking as a percentage of the total adult population. Our labor force participation rate has gone down like a rock over the last 8 years. People are quitting. They're either doing something illegal or they're relying on friends, neighbors, family, savings, all of that. That's one of the major reasons unemployment is down. It's not a measure of our success as an economy, it's a measure of our failure as an economy. We can't provide jobs to people for so long that we literally drive them out of looking for a job. Now, of course, where do they go? Well, as I said, they use up their savings, they use up their families' savings, they rely on their spouses, their boyfriends and girlfriends, and all the rest, causing unspeakable tensions in households across America, blowing up relationships that were already on shaky ground by the extra stress and burden that this kind of financial dependency would always produce. You'd need a psychologist or someone who really knows this to just begin to tell us the damage it has done to families across America. This is, of course, in a country where family values are very highly respected. And nobody's respecting the family values if you put that kind of pressure on a family that they have to leave the labor force and become dependent. There, of course, is an enormous array of illegal activities which we can't measure because no one keeps track of them, since the people engaged in them have a very good reason not to report the fact, since it's illegal and they don't pay taxes and all the rest. And that part of our economy is growing, that we know, from all kinds of evidence. But here's the second piece of information. There are people getting jobs. There are being jobs created. Not enough to deal with this problem I just described to you, but there are jobs being created. But the jobs are stunning in what they are, where they are, and what they involve. And I'm going to give you two examples. There are millions of these, but I'm going to give you two that came across my desk over the last month since I saw you last. The first one comes from Arkansas, and the second one comes from Massachusetts. I'll start with the Arkansas example, because when I give you these details, you'll get a picture of what's going on in America you can't get any other way. It's a wonderful capsule. Okay, here's what's happened. And I apologize in advance. My pronunciation of Chinese words is poor, and I'm being nice to myself. And if anyone here can help me, please do. All right? The Tianyuan Garment Company of Suzhou, China, just signed an agreement with the mayor of Little Rock, Arkansas, and the governor of the good state of Arkansas. They have purchased this Chinese textile company, a garment company. They have purchased an old, dilapidated factory in the middle of Little Rock, Arkansas, and they're reconfiguring it. It's going to be a factory that produces T-shirts for Adidas. It is gearing up to produce, ready, 800,000 T-shirts a day. A day. 21 production lines. There'll be one T-shirt every 22 seconds from each of the production lines. In order for this investment, and I'm surprised President Trump hasn't rushed to Arkansas to celebrate it. Maybe if he watches my program, he will do that. I don't know. I wish him well if he does. Eastern Arkansas suffered an enormous collapse of industry in the 1990s. Company after company moved to China, basically, and to take advantage of much lower wages in China. This mostly happened in the middle to the later 1990s. So we're talking the 20-year depression in that part of Arkansas when all the jobs disappeared and nobody came. The cost to the families, it's another part of America that's big on family values, the families in that neighborhood were destroyed. The jobs were destroyed. The communities collapsed. I won't go through all of it. You all know the story. Little version of what you know from Detroit and so on. But now that 20 years of lost lives of all those people is coming to an end because, we're supposed to believe, the Chinese are going to be producing in eastern Arkansas. I'm not going to deal with the culture shock that is going to happen to both sides of this complicated maneuver. We'll leave that. I want to read to you the statement of Mr. Tang, T-A-N-G. Quote, "Around the world, even the cheapest labor market can't compete with us. I am really excited about this," he said. So let me make sure you understand. They are using a brand new technology, a laser-guided cutting machine. There'll be no people. 800,000 t-shirts a day. They hope in 4 years they will get up to a maximum of 400 workers. What does this mean? The 400 workers will be earning between $14 and $15 per hour. Gone are all the jobs in the factories that were there in the 1990s, which paid better than that. In many cases, much better. And now, after those jobs are gone, 20 years of nothing, of destroyed lives because there was no work. They are now celebrating that they're going to have, instead of the thousands of jobs lost, 400 jobs paying $14 to $15 an hour making t-shirts, or rather, to be more honest, watching the machines and cleaning the machines that make the t-shirts. As if this weren't bad enough. And what's the point here? You're substituting, after 20 years, good jobs, factory jobs, good pay, benefits, some pension, and you're substituting jobs at low pay with nothing to go with them. That's what a low unemployment rate means if you don't pay attention to the quality of the job, what it pays, what it gives you, what chances you have to make a life with a job like that. But that's not the worst of it. The state of Arkansas contributed $1.6 million to the Chinese company to give them a tax break for the first 5 years of the... So not only is it this crappy jobs, but they're not even going to be paying into the state what they would have otherwise had to pay, because that's part of the inducement. $1 million in cash, $500,000 to help them do worker training, how to sit on a chair and watch the machine. $500,000 for that. Little Rock, the city, and Pulaski County, which is the county in which Little Rock is located, have given the factory a 65% reduction in the property tax that they must pay on the land. And you get the picture? Now let's go, folks. If the city of Little Rock, if the county Pulaski, if the state Arkansas are giving millions of dollars and foregoing taxes, where's that money coming from? Either they have to raise taxes on everybody else to give that money to this Chinese company, or they have to take the money from other things that the state of Arkansas and the city are doing for people and use it instead to induce this company to come there and to give them jobs that is going to make that part of Arkansas the poorest part of that state by giving them jobs at $14 to $15 per hour. That's what the full employment you're reading about is about. It's half about people that are not in the labor force anymore who are desperate, and the other half is about the substitution of the worst jobs imaginable for the jobs those people once had after a 20-year period where they had no jobs at all. If this is to be called economic development, or if this is to be called making America great again, you have to be crazy. Second example, Massachusetts. This has to do with the city, it's a small city, of Fall River. Some of you may know it, it's along the coast. If you go from here to Cape Cod, you pass through New Bedford and Fall River. They were once important industrial towns in the New England economy decades ago. They have been very poor for a long time because all the industry has gone. Like it left eastern Arkansas, it left that part of Massachusetts as well. But not anymore. New jobs are arriving in Fall River, and the big one is, ready? 2. Amazon has a warehouse it's building there, and FedEx has a delivery center. And I want to talk to you about that. Okay, let's begin. A road was built for Amazon. It's called, of course, when a road is built, it's the state of Massachusetts that used taxpayer money to do that in conjunction with Fall River. It is called, and I want your hearts to beat it, Innovation Way. That's the name of the road. You can't make this stuff up. These people live in a world like that. Innovation Way. It's designed for Amazon-bound trucks. Starting pay at the Amazon warehouse, hold on to your hats, folks, is $12.75 an hour, no degree required. There's one better than this. For junior inventory clerks. If that sounds like crap, I assure you, it is. For a junior inventory clerk with warehousing experience, the pay is $14.70 an hour, and it requires a bachelor's degree from a college. That's America. You go to college for 4 years, rack up 50 grand in debts, graduate, and you can work in a warehouse for $14.70 an hour. After you pay taxes, you could probably, for each hour you work, get 3/4 of a latte at the local coffee shop if they have a sale on lattes. Some of the jobs will be temporary hires through a company called, get ready, Integrity Staffing. Integrity Staffing, and you will pass along Innovation Way to your job. Yeah, we used to make fun of Eastern European countries who had a big picture of Lenin or Stalin on your way to work. Oh, look at that. We have Innovation Way and Integrity Staffing. The job description in Integrity Staffing, oh, by the way, this story comes from Forbes magazine. By the way, Forbes magazine has a title it gives itself. I don't know if any of you noticed. Capitalist Tool, which has a brilliant applicability if you think about it. They call them, they are very pro-capitalist. Forbes, used to be on a few blocks from here. Fifth Avenue, that big building, which I believe they've sold to the New School or something. So that's where this story comes from. The Forbes magazine, August 4th, it was literally a few days ago. And you'll see where the story is going when I read you the title of the story. Quote, China-like wages are now part of the U.S. employment boom. Forbes magazine notices China-like wages. You used to have to watch, modern geography TV shows to learn about people living at the standard of living in China. You don't have to watch TV anymore, Forbes is telling us. I'm going to get to that. The job description from one of the temp jobs at the Amazon Center that are provided through Integrity Staffing pays $12.70 an hour, but it requires the ability, I'm quoting now, to stand for 10 to 12 hours straight in a fulfillment center where the temperature will occasionally exceed 90 degrees. $12.75, you will get cooked. No extra charge. Then the writer for Forbes does a little math. He says a lot of the people here don't get full time. They get 30 hours a week. They don't get 40. Well, he says, let's do the math. If you got $15 an hour, which many of them don't get that much, but if you got $15 an hour, that's $450 per week gross, $1,800 a month, less than $22,000 a year in your annual salary. If you got 40 hours, which many of them don't, you'd get $28,000 before taxes. You are therefore going to be poor all of your life. That's making America great again, because that's the success. When you bring jobs to Fall River, Massachusetts, and for Fall River you could substitute 50,000 other places in this country, working very hard to bring them in. They also got subsidies, Amazon, for coming there. Money that the state now can't spend on schools or hospitals, roads, or anything else, given to Amazon so that the people there can have a job for $12, $13, and $14 an hour. And then the story really hits its stride. He said, this is remarkable, he said. The lowest paid worker in that warehouse, assuming 30 hours per week, and there are plenty of those, would earn around, as I told you, $18,000 annually, or roughly $7,000 more than the median Chinese worker now earns. Oh. If you earned $14.75 an hour working 30 hours a week, you would be earning $442.50 versus the median wage in Beijing, China, which is $329. Not that far behind, are we? We're not talking anymore, America, rich, the Chinese, poor. That's over. They're catching up fast. Because American workers' wages, in case you hadn't noticed, is going absolutely nowhere. Flatter than a pancake, American wages, for 40 years. Meanwhile, the Chinese wages are going up and up very fast. So it's only a matter of time, and what the author, Mr. Raposa, Kenneth Raposa, who wrote the article, what he's basically telling us is they're about there. They're about ready to cross the line. And he goes on. He says, a one-bedroom apartment in Fall River currently costs $1,000 a month. Now, I know for those of you in New York, this sounds like the bargain of the century, but it's Fall River. Believe me, the distance, culturally and so on, between Fall River and Manhattan is beyond your comprehension. I don't mean anything hostile to Fall River. I've been there a bunch of times, but it's not New York. $1,000 a month for a one-bedroom apartment in Fall River. A one-bedroom apartment in Beijing, China currently costs $930 a month. It's the same. The difference between the United States working class and the Chinese is disappearing. That's why the article is titled, China-like wages now part of U.S. employment boom. We are having an employment boom, and the meaning of it is we're going to be living in the standard of living that the Chinese have now acquired. What's going on here? Just so you understand, there is no return to the golden age of manufacturing that Mr. Trump promises. One of the reasons it isn't happening is those jobs don't exist anymore. It's not that they don't exist here. They don't exist, period. They're done. The technology has been developed precisely to get rid of those jobs and those workers and those levels of pay. That's why it's possible to have machines that will produce in Arkansas 800,000 T-shirts a day for the Adidas Corporation. What is going on is the following. When China becomes part of the world economy, and it's not just China, but I'm going to use China as an example because they're the major part of this story. When the Chinese enter the world economy, which is really only about 20 years ago, they bring with them hundreds of millions of workers who are now eligible, in a sense, to go to work producing what everybody else is producing in the world. And that gives capitalists everywhere an incredible power. because they're the ones who buy workers, who buy labor. And suddenly the supply of labor has gone through the roof, but the buyers are the same ones that were there before. It's a buyer's market for workers. And when you have a buyer's market for workers, wages go nowhere or else down. And that's what happens. Chinese people are replacing everybody. That's why all the clothes you wear come from China, and your toaster does, and most of the interior of your automobile does, and your TV does, and all the rest. You know. You do know. So wages are going nowhere in the world. You either have your wages go down because the job leaves, and there's too many of you left here in America competing for the few jobs, or you lose your job because a factory comes in and automates your job out of existence. And what we have now is the perfect storm. We have them both. First, we took our jobs and moved them out of the country. Now we bring them back, cheap labor, Americans so desperate that they have to work for $14 an hour in 90 degrees. And we have high technology, don't need very many of them. That means we're going to have a working class. That's what we're shaping up in this country, of unemployed people and people working at a level of suffering and a low pay and working conditions that are making us become what China was, what India was, what Brazil was, and what large parts of those countries still are. But the line of change is unmistakable. And there's absolutely nothing that Mr. Trump or the government of the United States is doing to change any of this. The celebration of jobs coming here is the celebration of this process. Not the end of it, not the changing of it, but the celebration of it. We should be grateful that we have these jobs. The governor of Arkansas, I believe the name Henderson or Hutchinson or something like that, gleefully poses for pictures with the Chinese gentleman who must be laughing their way to the bank as they collect the millions from the people of Arkansas to bring them a collection of jobs that will make that area poverty-stricken for the foreseeable future. Either poverty-stricken with no jobs or poverty-stricken with jobs. Make America great again? You have got to be. The irony of it is so bitter that you can't even enjoy the humor. But it is the reality. And it's happening everywhere. As I say, I could give you many more examples, but I thought Arkansas and Massachusetts, being so different in many other ways, have this exact same story. The only difference is in Massachusetts, it's an American company. In Arkansas, it's a Chinese company.
What about the FedEx?
What?
What about the
I don't know the details of FedEx. Unfortunately, the Forbes article is really focused on Amazon, which is the bigger game in Fall River than the FedEx is. By the way, if I had more time, I would tell you that Amazon, which loves to say it's the biggest, it is not the biggest. It has a competitor. The biggest producer of delivery, the way Amazon does, is a company called Alibaba, which is it's a Chinese company, which is building, is exactly like Amazon, and it is building these huge warehouses that are centers faster than Amazon is all over the world. But there's a global struggle between Amazon and Alibaba, and from everything I can tell, Amazon is losing that particular struggle. Okay. Let me turn now to the topics for this evening that have to do with capitalism versus socialism, and the three little topics that go under that that I put on the announcement. So let's start with the capitalism versus socialism. The first, there's so much to say that I know we can't get to it all, and we may devote future evenings to dealing with more of it. The first thing that I want you to understand is that the interest in socialism, which was, if not dead, close to dead for 50 years, has returned. And nothing captures that so much as the famous line, I think, of Mark Twain. For those of you who don't know, Mark Twain was a native of Hartford, Connecticut. This is important to remember because it's hard for people in Hartford to find much that was important in Hartford. And Mark Twain is certainly right up there with the top. And so he's sitting in his coffee shop, if they had them back then, one morning, and he picks up the Hartford Courant, I think it was called then, and it still is, the Hartford Courant, and reads in there an obituary of Samuel Clemens, which is his actual name. Mark Twain, not a real name. And he writes a very famous line to the editor of the newspaper whom he knew, and the line read, "Reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated." Signed, Mark Twain. The death of socialism has been celebrated so many times, it's getting boring. Every time the death of socialism has been announced over the last 150 years, lo and behold, it rears up again like some bad, scary movie in which the dead thing comes to life and frightens you. And so socialism is now coming back in all kinds of ways. The works of socialism, the characters of socialism. I'm going to give you 3 examples. You could pick up anything. The Atlantic Monthly magazine the other day, literally a week ago, has one of its contributing editors, a young woman whose name I've forgotten. Does someone know who can help me? No one saw that? Well, you should. She writes something, and they also make a video, which is on the Atlantic Monthly website. Very nice. She speaks for about 10 minutes, 12 minutes, not very long. And the topic is late capitalism. I kid you not. And she explains that this is a term that has a history that includes Karl Marx. It's got a history that includes, what is her name? You know her name. You're forgetting too, okay. And she goes through the history of, but the remarkable thing, she does a good job of it, a good history, she's got her information correct, but she's friendly to the whole thing. This is an interesting idea, she says, and she shows it comes right out of the socialist literature, the Marxist literature. I found that arresting. That's a major magazine in this country, the Atlantic Monthly, and has been for many decades. That's the first thing. The second thing was, which some of you I think noticed, is that I did an appearance a week ago, Monday, on Fox News. I did that. Fox Business News in the morning, Stuart Varney, I believe is the name, Stuart Varney, which I invite you to see. It's available on YouTube, on our websites, and so on. And there he is, Mr. Varney, who prides himself on being a right-winger, asking me softball-type questions about socialism. Couldn't I tell him why it's growing these days, says Mr. Varney. And there we are, having this conversation in front of however many people watch that program. I have no idea. Do you know?
It's at least 100, 150,000 live.
Okay. And there we are having a conversation about socialism and Marxism. It's kind of interesting. And the third example is that in a number of European countries right now, the latest edition of Karl Marx's Capital is getting close to bestseller status. It's selling huge numbers of copies. So what's going on here is a kind of interesting question. I could have given you, but I've talked about it before, so I don't want to repeat it, recent polling here in the United States that indicates people that are 35 and under in the United States, when asked the following question, which do you prefer, capitalism or socialism? A majority now say socialism. Here in the United States, young people. And that's consistent with everything that I see as I travel around the country giving talks. So let's talk a little bit about what all of this means. First, here's what it doesn't mean. It's not really a serious embrace yet of socialism, mostly because there is very little understanding or knowledge about what socialism is. People who are 35 and younger today means they've been in school for the last, whatever it is, 15, 20 years, which means they've been exposed mostly to teachers who don't know anything about it, who even if they knew something are afraid to spend much time at it, and who are super afraid to go into it in a way that might be deemed as positive or friendly or sympathetic. So they just don't know. They just don't know. It's a very serious issue. So what that vote for socialism over communism really means is we don't like what we got. And we know that what we got is capitalism. We don't like this. So you give us a choice between what we have and something else, we'll go with something else, and then we'll figure out later what that exactly is. If they do know something, what they probably know is a little bit about the Soviet Union or China or Cuba or something like that. And given the sources from which they have gotten that information, most of that information is negative. It's, they're dictatorial, they don't have democracy, they are whatever, poor, or whatever negatives have been associated with them. So we're dealing here with a disaffection from capitalism that is massive. It's massive in Europe, it's massive here, and it's pretty strong in many other parts of the world. Stronger than it's been in a long time. But it doesn't know quite where to go, this anti-capitalism, this criticism. It isn't inclined to go towards what it sees as socialism a la Russia, China, Cuba, because it has bad associations with those things, if it knows anything. Certainly those societies have done enough bad things to make it relatively easy to paint them in bad colors and negative colors. So between what has been said bad about them and what they've done that isn't attractive, this is not where people seem to want to go. There'll always be some, but it's not where the general flow of disaffection from capitalism is taking people. Well, then where is it taking people? Well, it will take them in the direction of a socialism if that socialism tells everybody, we're not the Soviet Union, we're not China, we're not Cuba, we're not any of the bad associations we have, and the best way to do that is to stick an adjective in front of it that everybody knows is a good one. Therefore, the first choice will be democratic socialism. That's if you can't choose between vanilla and chocolate, you ask at the ice cream store for 1 scoop of the chocolate. Because that avoids the difficulty. So now we have democratic socialism, and we have here in the United States a major purveyor of that particular move. There are actually 2. One is Bernie Sanders, because he's the public figure of democratic socialism. And the other one is the organization Democratic Socialists of America, which is very proudly saying these days that they have exploded in their membership and have 25,000 members across the United States and are therefore the biggest left-wing organization, which is probably true. So we have socialism what? We have socialism light. We have local socialism. But that's not surprising. If you're moving towards that, you want to take take it slowly, take it gradually, take it moderately. The important thing is people are going in that direction. We'll see how far they go. There'll be all kinds of struggles about how far they go. But one of the things that has to happen is we have to overcome, and this is a peculiarly difficult problem in the United States, we have to overcome 50 years of silence, 50 years of taboo, 50 years in which a reasonable conversation about socialism and Marxism, its strengths and its weaknesses, has been virtually impossible in the United States. I'm going to give you an example from my own life, just because that's what I know best. I'm an economics professor. I got my PhD in economics, so I've been a professor in economics departments in the United States. For those of you that are not familiar with it, the socialist tradition, the Marxist tradition, has a long history of work in economics. Marx himself was, he was a philosopher, he was many things, but he was certainly an economist among his achievements. And his major book, Das Kapital, is a work of economic theory. Given that, here's the remarkable thing. I have a PhD in economics from Yale University. I have a master's degree in economics from Yale University. I also have a master's degree in economics from Stanford University and a bachelor's degree in economics from Harvard University. I am a joke. I am an elitist joke. It's all true. I didn't make this up. I'd get into trouble if I made something like that up. So I didn't make it up. I was never required to read one word of Karl Marx for all those degrees. I mean, what else can I say to you? That's stupefying. That is so silly, so childish, so narrow, so frightened that you really don't know where to begin. It's like meeting an adult human being who has never had a conversation with anybody on the subject of sex. What are you going to do? You don't know where to start. You're kind of defeated before you begin. You're awestruck. Your words fail you. What? That's how I feel. I meet with my colleagues, professors of economics that I went to school with, that are teaching with me. I know all they do because I had to learn that. But when I start talking about what I'm interested in from the Marxian perspective, they look at me as if I just switched to Urdu. And I don't speak Urdu. And they don't understand it either. But that's the kind of conversation we have. 50 years in which you excluded them. I would say today, and I'm being generous, I don't believe 5% of the American colleges and universities have anyone currently teaching who either teaches on this subject or knows anything about the subject. I don't think 5%. My guess is 1% do. That means the overwhelming majority have never been exposed to any sustained introduction whatsoever to the economics of Marxism, which are very close to, not identical to, but close to the economics of socialism, communism, and all the rest. That is a reality. We have to deal with that in this country. So one of the key things about the struggle between capitalism and socialism right now in the United States is that we have to make up for 50 lost years. It's almost like a person who was arrested for a crime he or she didn't do and put away for God knows how many years, and then comes out and, kind of has to rediscover a world that's radically different from what it was when they went in. We have to discover how you talk to a fellow citizen if you're interested, how you study it yourself. How are you going to do that? How are you going to catch up? And I mean those of us here, too, who are sympathetic, I assume. If you find all of this distasteful, you probably went to the wrong church this evening. So we're going to have to figure that out. And part of what you see people like me doing when we're on Fox TV or anywhere else is we're groping around trying to figure out, how do we do this? How do we regalvanize the interest, feed it? People used to say to folks like me, I'm not the only one, heaven knows, but people used to say to folks like me, is it sad that you don't have many students? And I remember explaining to them, every year I've ever taught in the United States, I've had more students than I can handle. There never was a problem with the students. Not in the 60s, not in the 70s, not in the 80s, and not now. No problem with students. They're interested, they want to learn. They may be a little nervous, they may be a little skeptical, sure, and that's fine. It's good for students to be skeptical, whatever they're learning. But we've never had a problem with students. It's always with the larger society that's making it impossible for those students to sustain an interest. Students are taken aside, my students, and told by other faculty who don't mean me any harm that, for your career, it's not a good idea to do that sort of thing. Do this instead. Study statistics. No one's going to get angry at your politics for statistics. They don't understand what you're saying anyway, and it doesn't matter. Who cares? When you can get a good job, you'll get paid, you'll have a station wagon, and 2 dogs. So they don't come. But having students was never a problem. So the first thing I want you to kind of get at is there's an immense learning process that has to unfold now. You can see it already underway. Literally, to our amazement at Democracy at Work, the lectures I sometimes give or other people that I engage with, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are eagerly watching these things on videos. The interest is there, like the students were always there. The interest is there. But what has changed in America is that the larger atmosphere makes that interest okay. There's even a generational twist to this. As younger people, listening to their parents' generation poo-poo all this, are even more interested precisely because of that. It's like the parents, you must not go in that room becomes so attractive. You can't hold on to yourself. Well, as I was once told, I had this moment I will give you as a story because it articulates the situation. I was giving a talk somewhere in the Midwest, and it was some years ago now, and I came to the part about socialism, and I finished, and a couple of hands shot up, and a young man who looked very nervous stood up, and I was sure that I was going to get one of those responses that I was used to from years ago. I would give a talk on some subject having to do with socialism or communism, and I would finish, and up would stand someone who wanted me to say bad things about Stalin. And I would try to explain, yes, there's terrible things about Stalin, but it's not relevant to what I just spent an hour talking to you about. Could we talk about that? He would sit down, another person would get up and say, what about the Stalin? Oh, no. And I would have then to spend a lot of time talking about something I wasn't prepared for and wasn't really germane to what I was trying to get across, because people had been trained, socialism, Marxism, Stalin, murder, awful, awful, awful. And the basic question they were asking me is, you seem like a nice guy, how come you're talking awful? And I would have to say something which was this subtle equivalent of, I'm not awful. which sounds as lame as it is, you know? That was no fun for me. So I do my talk, and the young man stands up, and I thought, oh no, one of these, because he had that little nervousness that you get if you're going to give a talk. And it was being videoed, so there was light on the young man. And he started talking, and I realized he wasn't asking that question at all. He was basically saying, he danced around it, but his basic question was, very honest, what is socialism? He had no idea. But he knew enough to know that by asking me, he's asking somebody who's now going to give him a not awful story. I realized in that moment that the world had changed in this country. That these young people, they really didn't know, and they would like to know. It was wonderful. I then proceeded to give a glowing description of socialism in the hopes that he would find it attractive, which he seemed to do. That's where we are. We are now, and by the way, who gets the credit for this change of mentality in America? Capitalism gets the credit. Capitalism is our best organizer, second only to Donald Trump, to whom I now give the thanks that he deserves for irritating, outraging people who become therefore willing to consider all kinds of people and thoughts they would have before thought they shouldn't maybe pursue, but they are very important. And the next point about capitalism and socialism follows. Suppose you ask the simple question, what is socialism? Or for that matter, what is Marxism? The best answer I ever heard is the one I'll give you now. It is capitalism's shadow. You know the old fairy tales about trying to get rid of your shadow? There were various characters, little children's book about an animal that tries to get rid of its shadow, and you teach the child, you can't do that. The shadow is part of you. You can't shake the shadow. Socialism and capitalism have always been the institution and its irremovable shadow. Nothing guarantees the future of socialism as much as capitalism. They are each other's twins. The notion that you're going to get rid of that frightening shadow makes as little sense in the relationship between capitalism and socialism as it makes in your attempt to get rid of your shadow when there's light in the world. You can't do it. Capitalism produced socialism. Karl Marx, who still gets the respect he deserves because he was the greatest theoretician. Not the only one, no, he's not enough, but he's something around which you kind of have to wrap your head, because not to is to make a fire by rubbing sticks together when there are matches available. You know, use Marx. He did a lot of work based on a lot of people. Not to study him is childish. It's just ignorance compounded with malevolence, and it's above all stupid. And you don't want to be stupid. Most of us don't want to be stupid. It's the shadow. Marx begins his life enamored of the French Revolution. He's a young German thinker for whom the French Revolution is the liberation of the human experience, the end of feudalism, the end of the Dark Ages, the medieval time. It is the breaking out of the power of religion. Because if you know about the French religion, it was very heavily anti-clerical, anti the Catholic Church, which was wrapped up with the feudal lords. Marx loved it, like all the people of his generation. Those of you who cherish the music, say, of Beethoven. This is the music of the celebration of the French Revolution. In music, Marx is that in theory and philosophy. He loves it. And the French Revolution is not only the end of feudalism and the establishment of capitalism, but it's the end of feudalism and the establishment of capitalism wrapped up in the idea liberty, equality, fraternity, the slogans of the French Revolution. So it's a change from feudalism to capitalism, but it calls itself a change from slavery to freedom, from the isolated human being to the celebration of us together. If you've never heard, really, if you've never heard the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven, the final chorale section, the Ode to Joy, as a horrible translation from the German, but nonetheless, it is listen to it. It has this kind of triumphant movement of the world entering the realm of human freedom in all of its beauty. It's a spectacular piece of music, but that's Marx. He's doing the same excitement. And as he grows older, he's born in 1818, so the revolution's already 20, 25 years behind him. As he becomes mature and looks around, he has an epiphany, if you like. He looks around the capitalism of his time. Remember, he lives in Western Germany. He's familiar with what's going on in France and England, because those are the advanced countries of his time. Europe, for those of you not familiar, is a lot of little countries close together, so the language differences are not the barriers that they are in a place like this, where everybody speaks English almost coast to coast. You don't have that there. So he's caught up in the intellectual life of his time, but he looks around at the capitalism. And the epiphany is, he says, wait a minute. The French Revolution was successful. It got rid of feudalism. It replaced it with capitalism. But the promise was that this transition from feudalism to capitalism would bring with it human freedom, liberty, equality, fraternity of all people. And as I look around, he says, to Germany, France, and England, the most developed capitalist countries of his time, he didn't see liberty, equality, or fraternity. He saw a rigidly class-defined and divided society. He felt, like those of his generation, that the revolutionary hopes for the French had been betrayed, that the people of the world had gotten capitalism, and that the promise that capitalism would bring liberty, equality, and fraternity was false. And he set himself the task as an individual to explain why. Why did this happen? Why were we betrayed? Why did everything we hoped for not come to pass? And so he studies capitalism to get the answer. What is it, he says, about capitalism? And his conclusion is that capitalism is not the engine for liberty, equality, and fraternity. It's the obstacle. It, not some outside force, not some other thing, it itself precludes the very things it promised it would deliver. And then he reasons his way to come to this basic conclusion. Past societies, slavery, feudalism, were characterized by a tiny group of people who ran the show at the top, the masters, and an army of people who were the slaves and did the work. Or they were in feudalism, the few, the lords, and the mass of the serfs who did the work. Capitalism was supposed to be the end of all of that. But it isn't. Because if you study capitalism, you discover a tiny group of people called employers running the show for a mass of people who are employees. No wonder they couldn't bring liberty, equality, fraternity, because in the core of the society, the production of the goods and services without which we can't live, food, clothing, shelter, all of that, right there in the organization of production, there's a tiny group of people, the board of directors, the big capitalist, the owner, whatever you want to call them, and a mass of people who come to work and do the work 9 to 5, 5 days a week until they retire, get a watch, and drop dead. Or in a different order sometimes. There are people who come after you die, put the watch on just so they're complete. So he's angry, Mr. Marx. If you read his stuff, you'll see the man is angry. He's betrayed. But he has a creative side to him. He doesn't want to just stay with the anger. He wants the anger to have a form that will make other people see what he has seen. To take their vague sense of being betrayed and turn it into an understanding of what the problem is and hopefully an active commitment to changing it. So he writes books, gives speeches, tries to convey what he figured out to everybody else. And socialism has always been that. The desire, the conviction, the assumption, and I'll say it as dramatically as I know how, that you look around capitalism, you look around what we just talked about for the last hour, and you have got to believe that we can do better than this as a human race, because if you didn't believe it, you'd probably jump off a bridge. You've got to believe, and most of you do. Maybe all of you do, somewhere. But you've got to let that little bird fly. You've got to say, oh, yeah, we can do better. I'm sorry, I know it sounds like Obama's yes, we can. I didn't plan that. But we can do better. We can do better. And the impulse of socialism has always been that. Final points on this. What is socialism? Because we're really at the beginning. The answer is socialism is many things. And don't let anyone, including me, ever leave you with the impression that there is socialism. The remarkable thing about socialist ideas and Marxist ideas, and they're not the same. There's a big overlap, but they're not the same. But the remarkable thing about both of them is that from the early to the middle part of the 19th century, which is not very old, socialism and Marxism spread in a way faster and more global than any other comparable way of thinking across the planet. You compare the spread of Marxism with the spread of Christianity or Islam or any of the other global movements that started from somewhere and spread, then Marxism and socialism are stunning. They spread to every corner of the planet in less than a century. Less than a century. Anything, any social movement, any way of thinking that spreads to so many different places in so short a time, involving people in such different cultures and religions and levels of economic life and family structure, is going to, of course, be interpreted differently by these people shaped by their circumstances. So, of course, there are lots of Marxisms and lots of socialisms. One of the first things you can understand is if you are in the presence of a person who starts talking about socialism and Marxism as if it's in the singular, talk to somebody else. Because that person is either ignorant or trying to hustle you into believing that whatever it is they think it is the only way one could or should think about it. That's not true. I wish it weren't that way. It'd be really nice if there was a place you could go and this is it. Or if there was an agency that said, this is correct, this is wrong, this is the right one. There is no such agency. For a short time, after the Russian Revolution in 1917, very short time, there was such an agency. The Russians were the first Marxists to actually pull it off. They made a revolution, 1917. Nobody could believe it. Up until then, socialists had tried, but they had never been able to kind of take over. They had tried, but they hadn't worked. They had tried with violent revolution. They had tried with electoral strategies. Some countries, they went quite far. Germany was the best, Austria, but they never quite... The Russians were the first ones. And so they got an unbelievable loyalty. Everyone around the world who had begun to figure out what socialism was said, of course, they must have the magic recipe because they did it. They're in charge. So for a short time, whatever they said Marxism was, everybody said, that's it. And people who said, no, I don't see it that way, were immediately branded as something evil. You know, the split between socialists and communists didn't exist until after the Russian Revolution. There were no such things as communist parties. Let me say that again so you all understand. Before the Russian Revolution, everybody was a socialist. But after the Russian Revolution, because of the enormous respect that Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin got as the leaders of this thing, the ones who actually won, I mean, some of you are looking at me. Why are we all interested in Bernie Sanders? Because he did so well. Other than that, he would have been a strange old man from a state that has more cows than people. Right? We wouldn't have taken him seriously. But he did it. He showed us that a person with the name socialist attached to himself can actually get millions of votes in America, which is very important for us to see. But try to keep that in your mind. When Lenin, Stalin, and Trotsky emerged from the chaos of World War I in charge of what is the largest landmass country on this planet, Russia is bigger by geography than any other country in the world, people were flabbergasted. And so after the war, socialists split. Those who thought we have to do exactly what these guys tell us because they know how to do it, they did it. But there were a lot of other people who didn't agree with this or that, and they split. And the ones who didn't agree kept the old name socialist. And the ones who wanted to be loyal to the Soviet Union as the great leader took a different name to underscore their difference from the others, and that's when the Communist Party began. Communist Party all over the world starts in 1919, 1920, 1921, the years immediately after the Russian Revolution. Otherwise, there is no. And that was the issue for them. The Soviet, well, you have to get all of this, because if you don't understand that, you don't understand the history that will now flow. The communists and the socialists were angry at each other because they disagreed about this. Loyalty to the Soviet Union became a crucial part of the history. That's why China lines up with Moscow until they have their split in 1960. That's the history of this. We all have to learn that again, not the details, but to have a sense of what it is. What were the issues? The Russians and the socialists disagreed. The Russians thought the government should own and operate everything. The socialists said that's not necessary. I'll conclude with this story. In Germany, there's a terrible struggle going on right now. They're having a terrible problem. It may cost Mrs. Merkel her election, and she's very popular. Here's the problem. Their biggest industry is the producer of automobiles. VW, Mercedes-Benz, all of that. Those companies over the last 10 years have violated every single norm of decent behavior you could ask of any corporation. They have stolen money. They have faked their emissions control so that they've polluted the air with millions of cars that they deliberately phonied and have admitted to this. I'm not making any of this up. They have done and they're the biggest employer, and they're the richest, and they were abetted at every point by the political structure of what? Of the Christian Democratic Union, that's Merkel's party that runs Germany, but also of their governing party, the SPD, which is German for Sozialistische Partei Deutschland, the German Socialist Party, which is a partner with her. Last week, that partnership was really rocked when a leading German official of the Socialist Party, named Wein in Saxony, a very important part of Germany, was caught out by a newspaper having given this parliamentary speech he made about the automobile companies and what should be done to make them behave properly. Before he read it in Parliament, he had given it to the executives at VW to look over it to see if it was okay. You couldn't have had a more slavish behavior of a socialist, because in that country, socialism means the government controls things to make capitalism a little less harsh than it might otherwise be. For them, that's what socialism is. Communism is some evil excess that they don't want to have anything to do with. We're going to have to relearn just the broad outlines of that so that we can what? Come up with a socialism, something better than capitalism, some way to organize society differently. In order to do that, we have to go through the effort of understanding where we've been as a movement, even though it's been repressed in this country. It hasn't everywhere else. Every European country, you talk to people, they know the difference between a socialist and a communist because it's part of their life, and it has been for 50 years. Only Americans don't get that. Think that this is an argument about how you spell something instead of an article of substance. Very last point, I promise. I promise. Key to all of it, from my perspective, is Marx's insistence in Capital and that of the people that have followed him since, that you're not going to change a society in the direction of liberty, equality, fraternity, freedom, democracy, and all of that, unless you put that at the base of society in the place where most adults spend their lives, at work. And it's probably also true, although Marx didn't go at it, that you also have to transform the other place people spend most of their life besides work, and that's the household and the family. You have to change those institutions, because if you don't, all the other changes you make will be brought back to where they were, because you've not transformed the work relationships and the interpersonal relationships of a home. And that's the biggest problem that socialism has to face, how to conceive that, how to present that as a route to a really different society. But the help we will have doing it is that the existing society is falling apart. There's no nice way to say it, but you already know it. All I'm doing is putting it into words, which may be something that frightens you a bit, which I understand. Frightens me when I hear myself say it. It's over. It's over. We had a good run. Capitalism did nicely, 200-300 years. We are on the other side of the hill. We are going down. That's why the governor of Arkansas is excited to have 400 jobs paying $14 to $15 an hour for his people. That's called a low bar, really low. Thank you very much, and I hope I see you next month.